Welcome again to another episode of the Edwardo Series. In today's episode, we're going to delve deep into the mystery that Paul writes about in Romans 16:25-26. Now to him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel, and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery, which was kept secret since the world began, but now is made manifest by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of faith. Now might be a good time to note that in the Bible it says that God spoke to Moses mouth to mouth, even apparently, and not in dark speeches. But Paul says, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery. Everything that God said to Moses is pretty easy to understand, while Peter warns us that Paul writes some things which are hard to be understood. Paul can easily be misunderstood and misinterpreted if one has no foundation in the law and the prophets. Which is why, before we hear Pastor Edwardo, Paul tells us that he speaks to them that know the law. Pastor Eduardo's first point in today's episode for why we don't keep the law of Moses comes from Romans 7:1-4. But before we read Romans 7, Paul tells us that we first need to know the law, so then we can interpret Romans 7 correctly. We'll get back to that, but for now let's hear what Pastor Eduardo has to say about it.
But again, as you think about some reasons why we don't, come with me now to Romans chapter 7. When in this setting, the Apostle Paul is teaching the Romans a lesson about the law. Often we'll use Romans 7 to talk about the marriage relationship because it discusses marriage in verses 2-3. And the principle is that marriage is for life. But really the context is about the law. And he's just using marriage as an illustration to teach this law lesson. He said, Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law.
Stop. Listen to Paul before reading the rest of Romans 7. Paul is specifically speaking to those that know the law, and if you don't know the law before you read Paul's epistles, you will most likely read into the text what is not there and come up with an interpretation that will lead to lawlessness. Just keep that in mind.
He said, Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. Now this illustration. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband. How long? So long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. So then if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she should be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man.
From Paul's words here, those that know the law should immediately think of Deuteronomy 24, the law of the husband. Please pay very close attention because it's so important to understand where Paul gets this from, which is why he tells us in verse 1 that he speaks to them that know the law. Here's what it says. When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and giveth it in her hand, and sendeth her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband which sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. After that she is defiled, for that is abomination before the Lord, and thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. What that is saying is, if someone gets married and the wife has committed fornication, the husband may divorce her. Once she's divorced, the wife can go marry someone else. But if the second husband divorces her or dies, she can't go back to her first husband, or that would be an abomination. That's what the law says. That's what Paul's writing about. But who is Paul talking about, and why is he writing about the law of the husband?
And here comes the application he makes of that illustration, verse 4. Wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God.
Let's keep this straight in our minds here. Paul is writing to his brethren who are Israelites. He says that his Israelite brethren are dead to the law, and those that know the law, like we do now, know that he's talking about the law of the husband in Deuteronomy 24. I submit to you that Paul is giving us more than just an object lesson or an illustration, and everyone living back then who knew the scriptures would know that. Before we go any further, we need to go back to the giving of the law itself and all through the prophets. At Mount Sinai, God chose Israel to be his people. It was there that God married Israel. Jeremiah 2:2. Go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, Thus saith the Lord, I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness, in a land that was not sown. Isaiah 54:5. For thy Maker is thine husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, the God of the whole earth shall he be called. Jeremiah 31:32. My covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. Jeremiah 3:14. Turn, O backsliding children, saith the Lord, for I am married unto you. Clearly, from several different scriptures, we see that God married Israel. God is their husband, Israel is his wife. But what happens? In the time of King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel is split between the northern kingdom of the house of Israel and the southern kingdom of the house of Judah. From 1 Kings 11 and onward, the distinction between these two kingdoms is extremely important for understanding Old Testament history, prophecy, much of the New Testament, and most importantly, the real reason for why Jesus had to come to die and rise again. After the split between Israel and Judah, the northern 10 tribes follow other gods, committing adultery against their husband, the God of Israel. And so, according to his own law, God divorces the northern kingdom, as it says in Jeremiah 3:8. And I saw, when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also. But the northern kingdom of the house of Israel never repented, but instead continued in her harlotry with false gods, as the prophet Jeremiah writes. They say, if a man put away his wife, and she go from him and become another man's, shall he return to her again? Shall not that land be greatly polluted? But thou hast played the harlot with many lovers, yet return again to me, saith the Lord. This is the mystery. God married Israel, but they committed adultery, and he divorced them. They then continued in their adultery, marrying false gods, which means, according to the law, they can never return to the Lord their first husband. Yet God calls them to return, but is impossible and illegal, and nothing can bring them back, except for one thing. And Paul reveals the mystery for us in Romans 7. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law. And now we know the law, and understand the history of Israel from the prophets, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. And we now know the law that Paul is referring to, and how God is the husband and Israel is his wife. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. Again, the law that Paul is writing about is the law of the husband. Those that know the law know that Paul is writing about Deuteronomy 24. So then if, while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, not the entire law of God, that law, the law of the husband, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Wherefore, my brethren, and Paul's brethren are Israelites, ye also are become dead to the law. Which law? The law of the husband, by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. The house of Israel was divorced. They continued in their adultery and were barred from ever coming back. God calls them to come back, but his law prevents that. They are without hope, without God, and the only thing that can save them is the death of the husband. Jesus, the Word made flesh, is God manifest in the flesh. His death freed Israel from their adultery, and his resurrection allows them to return to him as he called them to in Jeremiah, even to him who was raised from the dead. Now here's where we start to get into trouble.
For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins, which were by the law, did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. And so in light of that, why do we not keep the law of Moses? This text teaches that we are dead to it and that we have been delivered from it. You might underscore those expressions in that context. Verse 4, dead to the law.
This is a perfect example of exactly why Peter warns us about using Paul to fall in the error of lawlessness. As also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures unto their own destruction. Ye therefore, beloved, seeing ye know these things before, beware lest ye also, being led away with the error of the wicked, fall from your own steadfastness. Here, Pastor Edwardo has disregarded both Peter's warnings about Paul's writings and Paul's warning in verse 1 of Romans 7. For I speak to them that know the law. If Pastor Edwardo knew the law, he would not be able to use Paul to prove that the law of God is now passed away, or that
we're dead to it, we've been delivered from it. That's why we don't keep it.
We'll have to put this topic on pause until next time. But until then, please feel free to watch this video as many times as you need to be sure that you understand the true meaning of Romans 7 that agrees with the law, the prophets, and the entire Bible. Or you can visit this YouTube channel and watch my video titled The Whole House of Israel, which covers this topic much more in depth and detail. But for now, I want to leave you with this verse. God, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. As Israel's husband, Jesus died to save his people from their transgression of the law. Now we are to walk in the Spirit, doing the righteousness of the law, and that's why we do keep the law of Moses.
And so one question we might ask is, to which law are we dead? The law to her husband, the law of her husband. And so one question we might ask is, to which law are we dead? The law to her husband, the law of her husband. And so one question we might ask is, to which law are we dead? The law to her husband, the law of her husband.